20 Florida panthers. That is all that stood between survival and the permanent erasure of the last wild cougar population east of the Mississippi River. The genome was collapsing in real time. Kinked tails, failing hearts, immune systems folding under the weight of generations of inbreeding. Scientists faced a choice: watch them disappear or attempt something never tried on a wild apex predator. But how did the Florida panther end up one bad breeding season away from total extinction? Puma concolor Cory, the Florida panther, is a distinct subspecies of the mountain lion, shaped over thousands of years by the specific pressures of Florida's swamps, pine flatwoods, and scrublands. It is not just a cougar that wandered south. It is an animal tuned to one of the most ecologically complex landscapes in North America. Historically, the Florida panther ranged across the entire southeastern United States. By the 1990s, that range had been compressed to roughly 5,000 square kilometers in the southern tip of Florida. An animal that once commanded an entire region of the continent had been pushed into a fragment of its former territory, surrounded by highways, housing developments, and agricultural land. As an apex predator, the panther plays a structural role in the Everglades ecosystem. It regulates white-tailed deer and wild hog populations. Without predation pressure, prey species overgraze vegetation, which cascades down into habitat degradation for dozens of other species. Losing the panther wouldn't just mean losing a single animal, it would mean losing the ecological function it performs across an entire landscape. So let's go deeper into what was actually happening inside that collapsing genome. The panther's most distinctive physical features, a crooked kinked tail and a whirl of fur on its back called a cowlick, were once considered natural traits, markers of the subspecies. Scientists later understood them for what they actually were: signatures of inbreeding, the genome expressing its damage in visible form. Hunting had driven the population down from the thousands to the dozens within a single century. Habitat loss did the rest. By the time anyone was paying close enough attention to count, there were fewer than 30 animals left, and the number was still falling. The panthers celebrated a new decade. They shouldn't have. For a while, things actually seemed fine. A handful of kittens were born. Biologists documented the animals moving through the swamp. That didn't last. Think of a family tree that has been folded in on itself so many times that the branches no longer reach outward. They loop back, crossing over the same nodes again and again. That is what the Florida panther genome looked like by the early 1990s. Approximately 20 individuals remaining in the wild. Every animal in the population was closely related to every other. Breeding between cousins, half-siblings, and in some cases full siblings was not an aberration. It was the only option available. The biological mechanism at work here is called inbreeding depression, and it operates through a specific genetic logic. Every organism carries recessive alleles, variants of genes that are typically harmless when paired with a healthy dominant version from the other parent. But when both parents carry the same harmful recessive mutation, which becomes near certain in a small isolated population, those mutations are expressed. The damage that was hidden for generations suddenly becomes visible in the bodies of the offspring. In the Florida panther, that damage was extensive and well documented. Atrial septal defects, holes in the wall separating the upper chambers of the heart, were recorded in multiple individuals. Cryptorchidism, the failure of one or both testes to descend properly, was documented in more than 80% of males examined. That figure alone tells you something catastrophic was happening. In healthy, genetically diverse cougar populations, cryptorchidism is rare. In the Florida panther, it had become the norm. The immune system was compromised across the population, leaving animals more vulnerable to parasites and disease. The kinked tails and dorsal cowlicks that biologists had once cataloged as subspecies markers were now understood as outward signs of the same inbreeding process. The reproductive data was equally alarming. Sperm quality in Florida panther males had deteriorated to a level that would have been considered pathological in any other felid. Studies conducted in the early 1990s found that many males were producing less than 25% motile sperm, meaning fewer than 1 in 4 sperm cells were functional. In healthy mountain lion populations studied for comparison, motility rates were dramatically higher. The Florida panther was not just struggling to survive, it was struggling to reproduce effectively even when it tried. The population viability analyses conducted by wildlife biologists in the early 1990s delivered a verdict that was difficult to argue with. Mathematical models incorporating the observed survival rates, reproductive output, and genetic trajectory of the population concluded that without direct intervention, extinction within 25 years was near certain, not possible. Near certain. The models accounted for random variation, for good years and bad years, for the stochastic unpredictability of small populations. None of those variables changed the fundamental outcome. The trajectory was terminal. What made the situation particularly stark was the ecological significance of what was being lost. The Florida panther was not just a subspecies, it was the last remaining wild cougar population east of the Mississippi River. Every other eastern population had been extirpated, hunted, displaced, fragmented into non-existence over the previous 2 centuries. If the Florida panther disappeared, there would be no eastern cougar left. An entire evolutionary and ecological lineage representing tens of thousands of years of adaptation to the American Southeast would be permanently erased, not locally extirpated, gone from the planet. The scientists who understood this were not dealing with a theoretical problem. They were watching an extinction happen in real time in a population they could count on 2 hands. The genome was collapsing. The bodies of the animals showed it. The reproductive data confirmed it. The clock, according to every model they had built, was nearly out of time. The question was no longer whether to act. The question was what action could possibly work and whether anyone had the courage to try it. Picture a room full of conservation biologists in the early 90s, staring at population graphs that point straight to them, debating whether the cure they are considering might be worse than the disease. The proposed solution was straightforward in concept and deeply contentious in practice. Bring in female pumas from Texas, specifically from the subspecies Puma concolor stanleyana, and allow them to interbreed with the remaining Florida panthers. Introduce new genetic material from outside, dilute the inbreeding, restore some fraction of the diversity the population had lost. The mechanism is called genetic rescue, and the underlying biology is sound. When a small inbred population receives an influx of genetic material from a related but distinct population, the harmful recessive alleles that have been doubling up are suddenly paired with new, healthy variants from the incoming animals. The expressed defects diminish, survival rates improve, reproductive output recovers, the population gains biological resilience it had lost. The controversy, however, was immediate and fierce. A significant faction of conservation purists argued that introducing Texas puma genetics into the Florida panther population would contaminate the subspecies. The Florida panther, Puma concolor cori, was a named, legally protected subspecies under the Endangered Species Act. Deliberately crossbreeding it with another subspecies, the argument went, would produce hybrids, animals that were genetically neither Florida panther nor Texas puma. The subspecies in this view would effectively cease to exist the moment the first hybrid kitten was born. You would not be saving the Florida panther, you would be replacing it. The geneticists and population biologists pushing for intervention had a direct counter-argument. The inbreeding had already destroyed the genetic integrity of the subspecies. The Florida panther of the 1990s was not a genetically pristine representative of its ancestral lineage. It was a shadow population, carrying a genome so compromised by recessive mutations that it could not sustain itself. Arguing for genetic purity in a population this damaged was not conservation. It was a philosophical position that would guarantee extinction while maintaining the appearance of principle. There was also historical evidence to draw on. Fossil records and genetic analyses indicated that Texas pumas and Florida panthers had not always been separate. Before human development fragmented the southeastern landscape into isolated patches, gene flow between puma populations across the south had occurred naturally. The 2 subspecies had interbred before. The genetic boundary between them was not a wall, it was a gradient interrupted by human activity. Restoring some of that gene flow was not contamination. It was a partial reconstruction of a process that had existed for thousands of years before it was severed. In 1995, after years of debate, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved the plan. 8 female pumas were captured in Texas and transported to South Florida. They were released into the Big Cypress National Preserve and surrounding areas, the core of the remaining Florida panther range. 8 animals, that was the intervention. 8 cats introduced into a landscape spanning hundreds of square kilometers, carrying genetics that the Florida panther genome had not seen in decades. The Florida panther would look back on this moment and wish they'd made a different call, if they had delayed even even a few more years, the model suggested the population might have dropped below the threshold from which no recovery was possible. The decision, controversial as it was, had been made just in time. Whether it would actually work was a question the swamp was about to answer. The Everglades does not give up its secrets quickly. Texas females moved into the landscape and largely disappeared into the cypress domes and sawgrass prairies, monitored by radio collar but otherwise operating on their own terms. Biologists waited, and then, within the first year, the data started coming back. But the version you've heard, that's not the full picture. The Texas females had bred successfully with Florida panther males. The first hybrid litters were being documented. This was the basic confirmation that the genetic rescue was biologically viable. The two subspecies could produce offspring, the offspring were surviving, and the experiment had cleared its first hurdle. And somehow it gets worse for the case against intervention, because the changes that followed were not subtle. They were dramatic, measurable, and arrived faster than many researchers had expected. Cryptorchidism, the undescended testes condition that had been documented in more than 80% of Florida panther males, dropped sharply in the first generation hybrid offspring. The rate fell to under 10%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a near complete reversal of one of the most visible symptoms of genetic collapse, achieved within a single generation. The harmful recessive alleles that had been expressing themselves in nearly every male were now paired with healthy variants from the Texas gene pool, and the defect largely disappeared. Survival rates told the same story. Hybrid kittens survived at significantly higher rates than pure Florida panther kittens had in the years preceding the intervention. The immune systems of the hybrid animals were more robust. Their body condition was measurably better. The hybrids were larger, healthier, and demonstrably more effective hunters than their inbred predecessors. The physical deterioration that had been accumulating across generations began to reverse. The population numbers started moving in a direction no one had seen in decades. The count, which had bottomed out at approximately 20 animals, began to climb. 20 became 30, 30 became 50, 50 became 80 or more over roughly a decade. Animals that had been confined to a shrinking core range began to expand their territory. Kittens that would not have survived in the pre-intervention population were reaching adulthood and reproducing. The genetic rescue was working. The biology was unambiguous. There is a version of the Florida panther story that ends with the hybrid kittens thriving in the swamp, the population climbing, and everyone agreeing that the right call was made. That version is incomplete, because as the recovered population grew, the question that had driven the original controversy did not go away. It sharpened. Hybrid offspring carried Texas puma genetics. Their genome was not identical to the historical Florida panther genome. Critics of the intervention renewed their argument. The subspecies that the Endangered Species Act had been protecting since 1967 no longer existed in its original form. What was living in South Florida was something new, a managed hybrid, not a recovered subspecies. The defenders of the intervention reached for a different framework. The concept of the evolutionarily significant unit, or ESU, shifts the focus away from genetic purity and toward ecological function and adaptive history. Under this framework, what matters is not whether an animal's genome matches a historical template, but whether it performs the ecological role of its ancestors and whether it carries the adaptive traits shaped by its specific environment. The hybrid Florida panthers were living in Florida, hunting Florida prey, navigating Florida habitat, and maintaining the ecological function of an apex predator in the Everglades system. By the ESU standard, they were Florida panthers in every meaningful sense. By 2003, the last of the Texas females had either died or been removed from the Florida population. Their job was done. The genetic diversity had been introduced. The rescue had been performed. What happened next would be determined by the Florida landscape itself, and what happened was revealing. In subsequent generations, Florida adapted traits re-emerged as dominant. The genome retained the diversity that the Texas introduction had provided, but the specific characteristics shaped by thousands of years of Florida adaptation reasserted themselves through natural selection. The population was not becoming Texan, it was becoming Floridian again, but with a healthier genetic foundation. The scientific consensus that emerged has been durable. Genetic rescue is now recognized as a legitimate and sometimes essential conservation tool applicable to any small isolated population showing signs of inbreeding depression. The Florida panther case is cited in conservation biology textbooks, referenced in recovery plans for other species, and used as the foundational example in academic arguments for the ESU framework over rigid genetic purity standards. And this is the part where things stopped being funny, because the genetic rescue, as successful as it was, solved only one of the two existential problems facing the Florida panther. The other problem was land. Panthers are not small territory animals. A single adult male Florida panther requires approximately 200 square kilometers of habitat to sustain itself, to find prey, find mates, and maintain the territorial ranges that prevent population collapse through competition. A recovered population of 100 or more animals requires an enormous connected landscape, not a refuge, not a preserve, but a network of linked habitats large enough to support a functioning apex predator population across multiple generations. The Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge had been established in 1989, providing a core protected area in Collier County. The Florida Panther Protection Program expanded land acquisition efforts through the 90s and into the 2000s, adding buffer zones and wildlife corridors to the protected network. These were meaningful steps. They were not sufficient on their own. The Panthers' range directly overlaps with the development pressure zone of Southwest Florida. Naples, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, these are not small towns. They are rapidly expanding metropolitan areas, and the land between them and the Everglades is exactly the land the panther needs to survive and expand. Vehicle strikes on Florida's highway network became one of the clearest illustrations of the habitat fragmentation problem. Panthers moving between habitat patches cross roads. Roads kill panthers. More than 280 panthers have been killed by vehicles since systematic record keeping began in 1972. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. The answer involves a combination of speed limits, road design, and the sheer volume of traffic on corridors like Interstate 75, known locally as Alligator Alley, which cuts directly through the panther's core range. The response included the construction of wildlife underpasses beneath Alligator Alley, concrete tunnels built specifically to allow panthers and other large mammals to cross the highway without entering traffic. Camera trap data confirmed the underpasses were being used. Panther mortality from vehicle strikes on that corridor declined. The infrastructure investment worked. Vehicle strikes, however, remained the leading human-caused source of panther mortality across the broader landscape. Every road crossing, every wildlife underpass, every land acquisition decision was a test case for whether human development and large predator recovery could coexist in one of the most densely developed states in the country. The Florida panther population in 2023 is estimated at between 120 and 230 individuals, a 6 to 10 times increase from the 20 animals that represented the low point in the 80s. Panthers have been documented in counties not occupied in decades, including areas north of the Caloosahatchee River, a geographic threshold biologists had been watching as a marker of genuine range expansion. That expansion brought new friction. Livestock depredation increased as panthers pressed into ranch land, and rancher opposition became a real political force shaping state-level conservation policy. The prey base, deer and hog population remains a limiting factor. Genetic monitoring continues, with biologists confirming that Florida-adapted traits remain dominant even as Texas-derived diversity persists in the gene pool. The recovery is real. The threats are real. Both are true at the same time. When you put this together, the Florida Panther case rewrote the rules. Genetic rescue is now the template for Isle Royale wolves, mountain lions, and inbred populations worldwide. The intervention proved that rigid genetic purity arguments can accelerate extinction rather than prevent it. Landscape connectivity is non-negotiable. Genetic health means nothing if habitat is too fragmented for cats to find each other. The cost ran into hundreds of millions of dollars in land acquisition, management, and research. Extinction would have been irreversible. The panther is now the symbol of Florida's conservation identity. On the state seal, designated the state animal, a cultural anchor for Everglades protection. The ice doesn't forget, neither does the swamp. If this kind of story matters to you, consider subscribing. There are more recoveries worth knowing about.